Christoph, can you hear me?
Okay, Ambassador, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Oh, hi, Mr. Kim. How are you?
Good to see you. Good to see you. Centrally controlled.
Hello, Frank.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody.
Ambassador An also entered. Yeah. Lamon is appearing. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Kim. This is Chung Gi-an.
Yes. Ambassador. Yeah.
Yes, you can hear me now.
Yeah. Very clear.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Be careful, recorded.
By whom? Yeah.
나만 근데 하얗게 나오지 이렇게.
내 화면 하얘요. 안 하얘라고 우리 앉았는데 우리 하얘서 앉았는데
그럼 노트북을 살짝 뒤로 조금만 해보시겠어요?
아니 그거 아니에요.
빛 때문에 이렇게 들어오는데.
한번 해보겠습니다. 손 돌려서 앉아봐.
아, 이걸 아예 떼는 거 말고. 조금만. 이쪽 근처만. 조심. 뜨겁지 않을까? 괜찮아요? 뜨겁습니다. 아니.
오케이, much better.
이걸 꺼요. 오케이. 됐어. 네. 조금 나아지신 것 같기도 하고. 여기 안에 들어오는 등을 꺼볼래요?
아니, 근데 여기 그런 게 좋아. 우리 아주 안 좋네, 이거. 교수님 때 그도 안 좋았어. 안 좋아, 이거. 안 좋아.
저걸 아예 딱 끄고
이거 풀어주려고 했는데.
네.
이것도 빛이 안 좋아.
So Ramon will be back later.
Okay.
So I don't know where my video is.
1 minute later should start. Exactly 4 o'clock.
So I'll just look for my video again.
목소리 껐다 켰다 이거 큰일이다 지금 보니까.
요 마이크는 사용하면 안 되는 건가요?
오른쪽 절대 하면 안 되죠. 절대 하면 안 돼. Forget. 이거 방송하는 건데 진짜. Girl with no name. 못 달라 이번 달에 내년이 불안인데 여기다 추가로. We should start. So okay?
Start time.
Yeah, 4 o'clock.
Then I run the video. Share screen.
On July 1st, 2011, the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement went into effect. Over the past 10 years, this agreement has successfully removed barriers to trade, thereby creating new business opportunities and jobs in Europe and in Korea. Trade data underline the significant positive effects. Trade in goods between the EU and Korea increased by 46% over this period. Statistics on trade in services reveal a similar upward trend. While European products enjoy a high level of brand perception among Korean consumers, innovative Korean products have played an important role in promoting cutting-edge technology in Europe. The stable and predictable legal framework empowered SMEs to venture into new markets and to build new supply chain partnerships. Besides dismantling tariff and non-tariff barriers, the agreement reinforces the protection of intellectual property, a decisive factor in today's rapidly accelerating knowledge economy. Finally, the Free Trade Agreement has ensured the respect of international environmental and labor standards. As the EU and Korea roll out their respective Green Deals and consumers increasingly call for more environmental sustainability, new business opportunities are arising in the fields of renewable energy and green technologies. By joining forces, EU and Korean businesses will boost their international comparative advantage in these essential growth industries and thereby contribute to the next decade of successful EU-Korea trade.
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning for those who following in Europe, from Europe. Excellencies, Maria Castillo Fernandez, Ambassador of the European Union delegation to Korea. Also, we have here Ambassador An Chong-gi, former Vice Minister of MOFA, and also former Korean Ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium and European Union. Dirk Lukart, Chairperson of the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and also many colleagues, Lord participants, and those who following from the guest. We have about almost 50 participants following this program. On behalf of the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies Jangmoneh EU Center, together with European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, I'm very pleased to announce the opening of this event, a kind of international symposium entitled with A Decade of Korea-EU FTA, looking back, looking forward. In fact, it has been a decade since the provisional application of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement back in July 1st, 2011. Since then, custom duties applied on goods in bilateral trade has been gradually removed, while the full implementation of the FTA was achieved in September 2015. For Korea, the EU-Korea FTA was the first trade deal implemented with the large economies. Starting this trade deal with the EU, Korea became one of rare countries in the world that secured FTA with the European Union, United States, China, and to the lesser extent with Japan in the framework of the RCEP. Korea-EU FTA was worked as a template for other deals thereafter and has been regarded as successful, particularly in terms of trade. In celebration of the 10th anniversary of the implementation of the FTA, it is high time to review what this FTA has delivered, both the EU and Korea, in multiple aspects, and what still remains as a next step. Academic experts from Korea and Europe together will discuss those and other issues today. I hope that throughout the symposium, valuable and insightful viewpoint could be figured out, and at the same time shed light on further consolidated relations between EU and Korea in the years to come. Many thanks. Now, I want to transfer the floor to our beloved Ambassador Maria. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. And thank you, colleagues and friends. And I'm not in Korea yet, but I'm very happy from Madrid to be able to be part of this event, because it's 1st of July is very near, it's next week. And there we are celebrating this very important 10th anniversary of the free trade agreement, as Professor Kim put it. It's therefore very, very timely that Hankuk University and Jean Monnet Center and the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea have got together with a very good panel of experts to be able to put a bit of light on what does this FTA means, not only for our trade relations, but also for our overall bilateral relations and relations with Asia. COVID pandemic has certainly played a big role in the resilience of our societies and our economies, but it has resulted in big global trade disruptions. And certainly we know through UNCTAD that 9% of the global trade in 2020 in value terms has fallen. And that is shocking, but at the same time we see South Korea very successfully controlling the economy, keeping the economy growing, and controlling the pandemic in a very successful way. And also, if we look at the European Union Korea trade relation, it has remained relatively strong and steadfast, I must say, during the pandemic. Our trade in goods has reached 9 billion euros in 2020. Our trade, if we include trade in service, 110 billion euros. So that's a lot, and especially in very difficult times. Europe is the 8th largest trading partner of Korea. South Korea, sorry, is the 8th trading partner of the European Union. We are the 4th trading partner of Korea. But what is important that in these trade relations, the FTA is the bedrock. It's really the key element which makes our relation very dynamic and growing faster. If we compare with 2010, and it's said in the video, our bilateral trade in goods had increased 46% in 2020. That's really a big change. And if we look at our bilateral trade in service, which is not mentioned in the video, it's even more impressive, 86.3% in 2019 from 2010. So those figures, these are just figures, but it shows that the FTA has made a big change in our trade and economic relations. And it has been a success story. It is our success story, and it's certainly a win-win situation. Don't forget that, and we have the chamber here in full, Europe remains the largest source of foreign direct investment, even more than the sum of the US and Japan investment in Korea. And that is something we sometimes don't think about it, or don't put it and don't highlight so in the relevant way it should. So our bilateral trade grew faster than the global trade in this 10 years. And that is very, very important. Now you are going to look forward, and because we have, you know, when we celebrate, we look at achievement, but we also look at what is missing and what needs to be improved. And you all know that Europe's trade policy now is very much on implementation and enforcement of all the free trade agreements that we have around the world. And this continues. We are very happy that then in this context, Korea just a month ago made the decisive step to modify the labor laws and the trade union laws and ratify the 3 conventions, ILO conventions that were there. This is part of the enforcement part of the FTA. But now we look forward. We have agendas that match. We have strategic priorities. We are looking at how we build better, mainly through green and through digital. We have both the Korean deal, the European deal, and this opens enormous opportunities for expanding our business. I think Dirk will mention this. We have an enormous area of renewables, digital, circular economy, and others that opens for us, where Europe has value added and can bring, you know, much more cooperation, economic cooperation between the two. We are speaking normally in our different groups, and there is an enormous interest to see the know-how that Europe has in all these areas. On the contrary, perhaps on digital, Korea has more knowledge than us. So there is a way to match these two areas. So how my main question to all of you is, how could the FTA help? In this area, it has helped. In others, there is a new area expanding. There will be more business coming, and the FTA is there to help. And how can we use it better to expand our business and our investments in Korea? Thank you very much, and let's see if good ideas come from this discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we'll move to Chairperson of ECCK, Mr. Dirk Lukert. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. My name is Dirk Lukert, Chairperson of the ECCK and CEO of Schenker Korea. It's a great honor to be here and welcome you to this meaningful event today. I would like to express my thanks to Hanguk University of Foreign Studies Jean Monnet EU Center for their great initiative to organize this special symposium. The EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement was provisionally applied from July 1st, 2011. At that point of time, the EU-Korea FTA was considered as, the most comprehensive trade agreement the EU had ever signed. The FTA was also referred to as the first next generation FTA. 10 years ago, the hopes for the FTA were high, and I can clearly state that those hopes have not been disappointed. In the past 10 years, the amount of trade between the EU and Korea jumped about 45%, that is from 60 billion to 90 billion euro, which is a very impressive number. The FTA brought custom duties down. In fact, the agreement eliminated 98% of all import duties for manufactured goods, agricultural products, services, within the first 5 years of the FTA's provisional application. The FTA also led to a certain standardization for technical products and the related certification procedures. Thus, what we observe and can see nowadays here in Korea as a normal consumer is a broader product variety, visible, for example, in wine and beer and supermarkets, but also with cars driving on the Korean roads. The same is true for Korean televisions or Korean cars in Europe. The FTA also helped a lot for a better commercial exchange of key technologies, such as, and among others, batteries, semiconductor, machinery, or process control systems, to just name a few. In fact, I, but most probably many other executives, are very happy with the EU-Korea FTA, especially with the advantages that the FTA has brought for business. The FTA has increased business relations, industrial cooperation, and has, in simple words, shortened the distance between Europe and Korea, resulting in intensified and strengthened exchange between EU and Korea in many areas. In short, the EU-Korea FTA is a really good one, which brought numerous benefits to both EU and Korea. Although the FTA can evidently be named as a good one, there's also a need to modernize, or at least to update the FTA. Companies improve their products, come up with new innovations to cater to the changed market demands and environment. I believe that this is also applicable to laws, rules, and regulation, and it should also be true for our free trade agreement. A static FTA will over time lose its effectiveness, whereas economic partners and trade among trading partners governed by a more progressive FTA will prosper. This was echoed in an event we co-hosted with the German Embassy in Korea and the Korean-German Chamber of Commerce. The event was held to commemorate the FTA's anniversary, seeking to update and modernize the trade deal to keep up with the rapid development of industry and economy. Speakers and panelists look back at the last 10 years and the achievements the FTA has brought to EU and Korea. Further suggestions to improve trade relations in the business point of view were raised and discussed around expanding the scope of cooperation beyond the areas of trade and investment to further increase the partnership between EU and Korea was held. I'm now looking forward to learning more from the academic experts' perspective on the EU-Korea FTA's 10-year anniversary. Once again, congratulations for the event, and I hope that everybody in the room will have an interesting and fruitful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lukat, for your congratulatory remarks. Now we move to Ambassador An Chong-gi for his keynote speech. Ambassador An.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. It's really nice to see you through this modern technology. My name is Chong-gi An, and I was a diplomat. Now I'm, private person working in the private sector, working in a law firm called Kim & Jang as a senior advisor. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks for the opportunity to speak before this symposium. In a week's time comes the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the Korea-EU FTA. So I consider this symposium is very timely and necessary. I congratulate and at the same time appreciate the Hoops Jang Monet Center and the ECCK for organizing this meaningful occasion. The Korea-EU FTA is something that has probably the most penetrating impact over the substantive relations between Korea and the European countries. It certainly has lifted Korea-EU bilateral relationship to a higher level. I'm proud that I was personally engaged in the negotiations for this great FTA from the start to the finish line. At some point in 2007, just before the launch of the negotiations, then Deputy Minister for FTA, Mr. Kim Han-soo, asked me to lead the sectoral NTB negotiations, saying that they would be the most difficult areas to reach an agreement. The sectoral NTB areas at the time were automotive standards, safety certification for electronic products, pharmaceuticals, and environment, and wine and spirits. I accepted that offer because I thought the NTB negotiations would be interesting and challenging. Some weeks before that offer, I already had a meeting in Brussels with the cabinet advisor to then Trade Commissioner Peter Mandelson. And she told me that the Korea FTA was the first FTA European industries opposed, and that for the European Union, the NTBs, especially the automotive NTBs, were the key areas for negotiations. Looking back those days, I can still feel that the mood for realizing the FTA was quite good in my ministry, and the spirit of the negotiating team was very high. For the automotive standards, there were strong oppositions to accepting what they call UNECE standards from Korea's regulatory agencies and also domestic industries. The idea of classifying the automotive standards for gradual harmonization was all mine. And I'm proud that in the end, we were able to create a good model for how countries can harmonize conflicting standards. In a broader context, for Korea, for many Koreans, Europe has been an admired partner in our long history. First, throughout our interaction, Europe has been the source of inspiration. Philosophy, political and economic systems, culture, and scientific knowledge that prevail widely in human society, we owe many of these to Europe. The European integration for peace and prosperity is also a model case for Northeast Asia, where no credible regional integration is likely in any foreseeable future. Secondly, Europe has been a benevolent partner and stood by Korea all along the history. When the unprecedented financial crisis occurred in Asia in late 1990s, it was European countries that made investment in Korea, providing much needed financial resources at the time. If we look further back, when the Korean War broke out in 1950, many European countries sent combat troops to help the Republic of Korea defend itself against the aggressor. We can say that today's free and prosperous Korea is partly of European making. Korea and the European Union established diplomatic relations in 1963, and at the time, Korea's per capita GDP was around $100. The European Union, or the EEC at the time, was also in its infancy with only 6 members. Both Korea and the European Union, we came a long way since then. Korea is now 10th largest economic power, and the European Union is a 27-member entity and the largest political and economic bloc in the world. Our relationship was focused on economic and trade relations at the beginning, but with the advent of the European Union with Maastricht Treaty in 1993, our relationship expanded to foreign policy and security areas. On the basis of these expanded relations, Korea and the European Union forged a strategic partnership in 2010. The European Union has a strategic partnership with only 10 countries, or 11 if we include recently partnered ASEAN. So I consider our partnership as very special and privileged. We have 3 important agreements: the Framework Agreement, the Free Trade Agreement, and the Crisis Management Participation Agreement. And Korean Navy vessels have been participating in the EU's counter-piracy naval operations in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Somalia in order to secure the safety of sea lanes. Now let me turn to the Korea-EU FTA, which will be the focus of today's panel discussions. As we all know, the Korea-EU FTA was the most comprehensive and highest quality trade agreement. Virtually all the tariffs on goods were eliminated and a wide range of services were liberalized. The protection of intellectual property rights was strengthened, and new areas like environment and labor were included. Bilateral trade in goods and services has expanded, and bilateral investment has increased consistently during the 10 years between 2011 and 2021. In Korea, the Korea-EU FTA was not so appreciated at the beginning, since Korea's trade surplus suddenly turned into a deficit. Some experts argued that the turnaround of trade balance is rather due to the Eurozone debt crisis since 2010, and if there had not been the FTA, the deficit could have been more severe. Others argued that the deficit was caused because Korea began importing Brent crude oil. But with the coincidence of turnaround in trade balance and the entry into force of the FTA, it was rather difficult to promote the strengths of the FTA at the time. FTAs have other merits like increased welfare and more choices for consumers. But I think the most positive impact of the Korea-EU FTA to Korea is that the FTA has strengthened overall global competitiveness of Korea. The FTA brought Korean industries the level playing field where they have to compete with the most advanced companies in Europe. At this point of the 10th anniversary, what we have to think is how to update the FTA. There is a saying in Korea, in 10 years' time, even mountains and rivers change shape. So 10 years is a long time. I remember that right after the entry into force, the European Commission already wanted to revise some parts of the agreement, such as the provisions on the direct transport and tractors. Our FTA should be upgraded by including investment protection and more liberalization of the services areas. In addition, new developments in technology and trade patterns should be reflected, since there has been a sea change in the business environment in the last 10 years or so. The most remarkable change is digitalization. Everything is going digital these days, but there are no credible international rules in this area. Korea and the European Union have been working together for data protection, but there are other areas such as digital standards and cybersecurity where we can lead global regulatory framework, as both Korea and the European Union are in a leading position in the ICT and digital technology. Another important area for further cooperation is green economy. With the European Green Deal, the European Union is certainly front runner in leading green economy. Last year, Korea also announced its Green New Deal policy with the aim of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea and the European Union can cooperate in policy coordination and in trade-related aspects of international efforts to reduce emissions. Finally, I'd like to say that our societies need to provide political impetus for the upgrading of our FTA. Trade agreement in most of the times is sensitive to some economic sectors, and therefore burdensome for politicians and government officials. We, as experts and business leaders and thinkers, should infuse rationale for making the FTA relevant for the changing world. In this regard, I hope that today's event could pull the trigger for upgrading the Korea-EU FTA. Winston Churchill once said, "The price of greatness is responsibility." 10 years ago, we, as partners, made the great FTA. And now it is also our responsibility to lift it to the next level. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador An, for your insightful idea how to proceed any modernization in terms of FTA between Korea and European Union. I think for this we have to close our opening session, and right after we are going to next session, which is the main panel discussion presided by Mr. Christoph Heider.
Good. So I hope that everybody can hear me. Thank you very much, first of all, for Shihong. So I think we're now all muted, except me. Thank you very much, Shihong, for the introduction. And also thank you very much for all those, for the speakers. I know that Maria, the EU ambassador, is very attached to the EU FTA, but I was also listening very carefully about what Ambassador Ahn Cheong-gi was telling, and I agree in many things. And of course, I also appreciated the positive things by my boss, Dirk Lukert. I'm Christoph Heider, President of the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and I will be moderating the panel on the 10-year anniversary of the EU FTA. I think we have a pretty diverse lineup today. So we have professors from three countries, 2 continents, and all experts in their fields. And so I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion. So maybe just to name all of those professors. So we have Kang Yu-duk from the Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. We have Kim Bong-chul, also from Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. We have Andrew Millett from Busan University of Foreign Studies, all foreign studies, based here in Korea. And we have Frank Röbekamp from Ludwigshafen University, and we have Ramon Pacheco Pardo from, I think he belongs to 2 universities, to the King's College, but also to the Free University of Brussels. So I stop talking and would like to hand over in this order now to the professors, to the experts, to share the insights with us, with the audience. Maybe just one slight remark before I really hand over. So if there are questions from the audience, please enter those into the chat box so that I can raise it later, let's say, to the professors when we have the open discussion. But now I would like to give the floor to Professor Kang Yu-duk.
I'm sorry. I just they're muted, but what I said is just an introduction and appreciation to organizers. So what I'm saying now is the beginning of a presentation. The Korea-EU FTA is actually the EU's first comprehensive FTA on the global Europe. So after this FTA, EU successfully concluded and implemented FTA with another country such as Colombia, Peru, Central America, Singapore, Japan, Vietnam, and Canada. And from a Korean side, this FTA is the first FTA with large trade partners. The Korea have FTA with the European Union, and 6 months later, Korea-US FTA was implemented, and then Korea successfully concluded FTA with China and so on. So this FTA is very important, and it's kind of the first initiative for Korea to connect the large economies. And but what is particular for this FTA from Korean perspective is actually Korean trade balance with the European Union became negative since 2012. In 2007, Korea have almost 19 billion US dollars as trade surplus vis-a-vis the European Union. But after implementing the FTA with the European Union, Korea export to European Union stagnate, while Korea's import from the European Union increased in a dramatic way. But both in Korea and European Union, this FTA has been appreciated as successful. If you look at the FTA, the trade statistic between the two parties, you can, I'm sorry, let me just check just one thing. We can clearly find that the trade balance between the two parties has been, Korean trade balance became negative after implementation of the FTA. We will see another statistic from the Eurostat, at least for Korean statistic, Korea had trade deficit with the European Union. But during the same time, Korea's trade balance with the United States, it has been increasing. So we show diverging path of trade balance vis-a-vis the European Union and vis-a-vis the United States. I think there are several reasons which explain the change in trade status between the two parties. A general level of tariffs in Korea was higher than that of the European Union. So I think when we remove tariffs, the effect is more direct on Korea than in Europe, and also the Korea is a small country compared to European Union. So when we remove tariff, the impact on trade status is much larger for Korea. Particularly, Korea import increasingly more consumer product and automobile, and also the oil from the European Union. But there are two other factors not really related to FTA itself. The first factor is a temporary factor, let's say the business cycle factors. Business cycle factor is explained by the GDP growth rate in Korea and European Union. Usually Korea have a higher growth rate than that of the European Union. When country A is higher growth rate than country B, that is normal, that country A imports much more from B than what country B import from country A. So I think that GDP growth trend has a strong impact on bilateral trade between two parties. And another factor is actually exchange rate. As a trade person, we do not talk about exchange rate in order to explain the bilateral trade, but it is quite clear that since 2011-2012, European Central Bank used to implement large-scale quantitative easing due to euro crisis and deflation in euro areas. This kind of quantitative easing of a European Central Bank allowed to euro to have a low value vis-a-vis the Korean won, and that I think that affect a lot on trade between the two parties. The other factor is a structural factor. I want to focus on this factor as well. I will explain a little bit the relocation of Korean industries and composition of Korean export and import vis-a-vis the European Union changed considerably over the last 10 years. I conducted a small-scale regression analysis focusing on GDP growth rate of the European Union and exchange rate of euro. When we regress those two variables over Korea's export to the European Union, we have clear statistics that Korean export is very sensitive to GDP growth rate in European Union, and also sensitive to Euro Korean won exchange rate. So I think two factor works statistically significant way to boost the import from the European Union. And then I slightly share the previous research that I've done, particularly focusing on the value of euro and German export. Actually, because Germany is the most important trading country in euro areas. As we know, Germany is an industrial powerhouse and it has very strong competitiveness in industrial sectors. But we found it is clear that the German export is strongly correlated with value of euro. Once euro value goes down, actually German export is increasing. I don't think that's the only factor that boosts the German export, but at least it affects on the German export and overall export of the euro area to the third countries. And then when we compare Korea's export to different trading partners, starting from the European Union, China, United States, Japan, and ASEAN, actually export to European Union stagnate, but the export to United States and ASEAN and China has been increased during a same period. And then when we look at the Korean import from those countries, for FTA implementation period, particularly between 2011 to 2014, we can clearly find that Korean import from the European Union increased in a very salient way. As a result, the trade share of the European Union in Korea, particularly from export, has been decreasing. In 2005, the EU represent almost more than 15% of total Korean export to the world, while it declined less than 10% in 2019. But what Korea export from the European Union, it has been increased, and the EU share in Korean total import increased from the 10% to 11%. Well, I think there is this kind of a cyclical element affect the trade balance between the two parties. But since 2015, trade balance has become stable. I mean, the Korea have a low level of trade deficit vis-a-vis the European Union since 2015, and I think it's locked in structural way. So I think it will continue over the next 5 years if we don't have any kind of the dramatic event. For structural element, I want to emphasize Korea's export to European Union. I mean, in terms of product, experienced dramatic change. In 2010, the ship represent more than 20% of Korean export to the European Union, followed by LCD, liquid crystal device such as a screen. It represents 9%, and communication equipment, I mean the smartphone, it represents almost 7%, and so on. But if we get the statistic in 2019, those three most important export element is completely gone. You can find a ship just 4%, and LCD just disappeared, and communication equipment is almost disappeared. I will argue, but the new items such as battery it became one of the most export items for Korea to the European Union, and automobile represent almost 16% of total export to the European Union. So we can clearly identify dramatic fall of export of LCD to the European Union. Communication device, it fall dramatic way. Ship fall as well. Communication part, I mean the intermediate product for smartphone, it declined as well. But the export of battery, it increased dramatic way. Automobile is full during a financial crisis, but it recovered and it increased. Auto part increased as well. The main reason of this trend is for LCD, for Korean industry, LCD are already at the phase of end of product cycle. The Korean company do not produce LCD anymore in Korea. And then for communication device, as we know, the large part of the smartphone industry, they relocate their production base from Korea to Vietnam and Southeast Asian countries. So not many export from here to European Union. For ship industry, we know that there is a big global demand cycle. The actual demand cycle is quite low for now. So it's the main reason that the Korean export to European Union decline over the last 10 years. But for automobile and part, there is a big, good recovery in European market. And many Korean industry, they relocate the production base from the Korea to Central and Eastern Europe. And for battery, actually, this is a good industry which just start its product cycle. So there will be continuous export of battery from the Korea to the European Union. And I will show you just the last two slides. I just tried to calculate the product concentration index for Korea's export to European Union and import from the European Union. What is interesting is actually product concentration index of Korea for export to European Union declined over the last 10 years. Actually, Korean export to European Union is increasingly diversified in terms of product. But in case of input from the European Union, I mean, the European export to Korean actually is concentrated over a few sectors. The most important sector is actually automobile. So this kind of change in product concentration, actually that I think that this is kind of a structural change on bilateral trade between Korea and European Union. This is the last slide that I want to mention. First figure in left part is Korea's trade with the European Union, and this is data from KITA, Korea International Trade Association. Korea have a trade deficit according to that statistic, but when we look at the same trade from the Eurostat, we can find that Korea have a trade surplus vis-a-vis European Union in year 2019. It's very hard to explain the difference between two statistics. I think it's necessary to look at the sector by sector to find out why there is a data discrepancy between two parties, or is there any different method, or the relocation of Korean industry has been reflected on trade data in different way between KITA and Eurostat. That will be very interesting topics. And okay, with that presentation, let me just finish the overview of trade between two parties over 10 years. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you very much for your lecture about trade balances. In the Q&A, there is a comment by the former EU Ambassador Michael Reiter that in fact these different data definitions by Eurostat and KITA is currently being worked on. So hopefully we have some clarity there soon. So now we leave trade data or data behind us and we move to a more legal stuff, legal challenges. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Kim Bong-Chun. The stage is yours. And I would like to ask you to take over.
All right.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Kim from Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Well, yes, I want to talk about the quite sensitive issues, but to me, it's time to talk about the point. Yes. Yeah, this FTA, we have the 10 years history already. So we can evaluate the value in the perspective of the law. I think this bilateral FTA has used for the stepping stones to the you hear me? Okay, yeah, right, yeah. Stepping stones to the further relations between Korea and the European Union. So yes, as we know that after the Korea-EU FTA, two partners, they expanded the relationship, not just for the economic and trade issues, but also non-economic issues as well. And we revised the framework agreement as well. So let me just briefly see the point of legal issues in the Korea-EU FTA. Regarding the bilateral relations, we can see the different types of the sources of international trade law. For example, the WTO agreements are very general rules for their economic operations. And also, Korea-EU FTA is one of the good example of the bilateral trade laws between two partners. And also, Korea and one of European Union members, such as Poland, they can make the agreement between just for the two countries, under the umbrella of the European Union law, and this agreement can make some kind of legal details for the two different partners. Those kind of different laws have the some kind of relationship, such as the general and special law relations. And for example, in the WTO rules, they have the special provisions regarding the FTA, such as the Article 24 of the GATT. So those kind of provisions can be a kind of bridge between the preferential trade agreements, such as FTA, and the WTO general rules. And also, between Korea and the European Union members, the agreement have some kind of legal background, such as the Korea-EU FTA. So under the Korea-EU FTA, the Korea and the one member of the European Union, they can make some a bilateral agreement for the details of the relations. Let me see the bilateral agreement between Korea and the EU. Yes, Korea-EU FTA is the one of the topics of our seminar. And then the Korea-EU framework agreement, which is made in 1996, it was revised in the 2010 with the FTA. And also, 2014, Korea and the European Union, they made a special fundamental agreement for the participation of Korea in the EU crisis management operations. So it is not about the economic or trade relations, but we can say that this agreement, non-economic related issue agreement, can be based on the Korea-EU framework agreement or Korea-EU FTA relations. Okay, let's move on to the other point. Korea-EU framework agreement was made in the 1996. So for a long time, between two partners, their relations are regulated, or supported by this framework agreement. But in 2010, as we know, the bilateral FTA established in 2010, and then this framework agreement was revised. And then, 2014, the agreement for the participation of Korea in the EU crisis management operations, it was established in 2014 based on the strategic partnership relations. And I want to say that this agreement, even though this agreement is for the non-economic issues, but this agreement made based on the FTA, the relationship. If the Korea and the European Union, if they didn't have this FTA, then I believe that the crisis management operation agreement couldn't make by two partners. Let me say something about the international law and domestic law relations. Yes, Korea and the European Union, when they made the FTAs, two partners has to change their many domestic rules. Let me show just the examples. Between 2008 to 2012, in the Korean societies, there are so many Korean domestic laws has changed, and sometimes the Korean government had to make new domestic laws with these FTAs. Some people may say that Korea-US FTA made the impact to this situation, but I want to say that Korea-EU FTA also made huge impact to this situation as well. So these many domestic rules are the examples of the changes of Korean domestic laws with the Korea-EU FTA. So Korea and the European Union, they made FTA relations. And these FTA made many kind of influences to the Korean societies and the European Union societies. And then the FTA made influence to their international law and domestic law as well. So if we say that Korean domestic rule and the Korean international law was changed by this FTA, then it's time to think about revision of this FTA. Because yeah, already we have 10 years experience with this FTA. And also, Korean society has changed many domestic rules and changes of society itself. Now, of course, the European Union already proposed to Korea to change or revise this FTA, but to Korean society, the Korean side, I think it's time to think about the revision. Yeah, let me let me talk about this point. The FTA, of course, directly it's related to the economic and trade issues. But I believe that these FTA made the huge influence to the non-economic issues, such as the security and peacekeeping issues, human rights, labor, environment issues, yeah, and sometimes development issues. So Korea and the European Union, two partners, I hope, yeah, two partners can talk about these new issues. Then, with the consideration of these kind of new issues, we can think about new stage of revision of the FTA. Yeah, we are in the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So maybe, yeah, this situation push the Korea and the European Union to think about this point. And also, mainstream of international societies are changing. So new issues such as sustainability, yeah, these issues can make the huge impact to the mainstream of international law. So of course, the Korea-EU FTA has the very special chapters, chapter 13, regarding sustainability issues. But I hope that we can develop these provisions for the another decade in the future. So yeah, and also political issues such as Brexit and the North Korea issues. Yeah, two sides has the kind of very difficult work to solve these issues. So those kind of situation, yeah, pushed us to think about the revision of the FTA. Chapter 13 of the FTA is about the trade and sustainable development issues. It's mainly focused on the environmental issues and the labor issues. When the two partners made the FTAs, Korean side had a lot of the homework to improve the, especially in the labor area. So, so many times the European Union, they made their opinions to the Korean side to improve the labor standard in Korean societies. Yes, with those kind of opinions and advices, Korea improved these area, the standard in many ways. But I think it's time to think about the new stage. Yeah, recently Korea joined the core international law regarding the labor issues. But the Korean domestic society still has many work to change regarding labor issues. So considering this point, yes, the Korea and the European Union, we can talk about the revision, especially regarding sustainable development and trade issues. Yeah, and yeah, for example, and also the European Union, this side, their single market, their shape of single market is a bit changed with the Brexit issues. So yeah, also European Union, they have to revise their FTA without the consideration of the opinions of the UK. Yeah, it's kind of a homework for the partners. I just mentioned about the sustainability issues, but these issues can be related to the our new job, such as the digital single market for the European Union, and also pandemic issues for the European Union as well. These issues are similarly to the Korean society as well. Okay, I think it should be enough from me. Thank you very much.
So I'm unmuted again. Please mute yourself.
Okay.
Good. So I think it was pretty insightful. It's quite complicated, these legal frameworks, legal procedures, yeah, but I think it was pretty good. We still have. Can you maybe also plug in your earphones so that we don't have the loudspeaker? Right. Yeah. It's good to have homework. Yeah? And yeah, with this, so we still have one professor here in the room in Korea. And this is Professor Andrew Millett from the Busan University of Foreign Studies. Yeah, so Andrew, please take over.
Okay, so thank you very much, Christoph. Welcome, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium. As a British man, I feel very honored to be here. In 10 years' time, maybe I will not be back. Also, thank you, Professor Kim, for bringing up Brexit. Very nice of you. So today I'm going to focus on the environment and sustainable development, focusing more on environment and climate change, to be honest. But yeah, I'll get straight into it. Oops. Okay, so we'll just talk a very little bit about what it mentions in the FTA about environment policy and climate change and so on. Then we'll look at some of the reports that have been produced by the European Union on environment and sustainable development. And then I thought we'd focus on what is the current policy of the EU, what are the current policies in South Korea, and give a little summary of where there are some overlaps and possible ways of future cooperation. So Chapter 1, Article 1.1 talks about the objectives. If you read down to paragraph 2, subparagraph D, then we get the first mention here of sustainable development, which, as you can see, means that paragraph 2, A, B, C, D, E, F don't mention environmental sustainable development at all. The emphasis is very much on trade. So in the UK, when I was growing up, we had this TV advertisement for a paint company. It says Ronseal does exactly what it says on the tin. Now, if we talk about the EU-South Korea FTA, free trade agreement, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It is very much a trade agreement. I would argue sustainable development, environmental policy, climate change has very much been a lesser part of this agreement. The focus very much is on the trade. Okay. Paragraph 2, so paragraph H, talks about promoting foreign direct investment, again, without lowering or reducing environmental, as Professor Kim just mentioned before, labor and safety standards. Okay, so we'll skip over to the next one. So that's all it mentions in the first chapter, then up to chapter 13, again, as Professor Kim has just been talking about, so we can skip this fairly quickly. Article 13.1, paragraph 1, very similar to paragraph 2, so paragraph G there. 13.1, paragraph 2, talking about the underlying the benefit of cooperation. So there's a lot of talk about cooperating on climate change, cooperating on environmental promotion, sustainable development, but there's no sort of legally binding aspects to this FTA. It's very much just about where we can cooperate, let's cooperate. Otherwise, like it says in Article 13.13, parties recognizing it is not their intention to harmonize labor or environmental standards. Okay, so simply in terms of the FTA, 10 years ago, it was very much about, could we cooperate? If we can, let's cooperate. Let's try to promote sustainable development. Otherwise, the focus is on trade. The rest of the chapter, again, as we saw in Professor Kim's presentation just a moment ago, covers different areas. An important one that I thought, especially for environment, climate change, was this idea of multilateral environmental agreements, the fact that both the EU and Korea are allowed still to participate in all of these different environmental agreements, cooperation activities, mechanisms, when and wherever they like. So if we look at some general environmental data, now the source for this data here was the final report, which was actually published by the EU in May 2018. So it's slightly out of date. And as you can see, the data really only goes up to 2014. So there were 3 reports actually produced. The first one in 2016, second one, the synthesis report in 2017, and then this final report in 2018. But just as sort of general sort of tendencies, what it shows in terms of CO2 emissions, European Union, represented by this blue dashed and dotted line here, we can see it was already starting to go on a downward trend, a positive trend downwards, that is. From the FTA, it continued that reduction of emissions on a yearly basis down to 2014. Whereas South Korea, which is highlighted here in the red, as you can see, it was increasing before the FTA. Once the FTA was implemented, again, slight increase. In fact, in 2010, from data that I have, South Korea's CO2 emissions increased by almost 9% just in that year alone. Various reasons possibly behind that. But since then, it's pretty much been on the same levels. If we skip across to figure 104, which is greenhouse gas emissions in general, again, we can see that the European Union has followed that similar downward trend, lots of reductions, whereas South Korea, again, very similar to CO2 in general, has shown increased emissions and not too much improvement there. Now, is this based on the FTA? In my opinion, that's very difficult to answer. Obviously, as we said before, we have the EU-Korea FTA, and a few months later, we also have the Korea-US FTA coming in, different FTAs. Is it possible to say that, oh, just because of the EU-Korea FTA, environment is going to improve or decline? No. So that's, I think, something we need to think about. Skipping over to EU progress. As you can see here, EU KP, so 1990 to 2019. This is from the annual European greenhouse gas inventory from 2021. So this is the most recent data. This includes the UK and I think also Iceland as well. Okay. But as you can see, European Union has since 1990 been on a very much declining trend. If we skip over to here, it's just going to move back over here. Okay, so we can see again CO2 emissions by different categories. So total CO2 has declined by a large amount. Public electricity and heat production, manufacturing, others, residential, and so on and so forth. The only one which showed an increase is road transportation. I'm not sure why they didn't include aviation in that one. If you look at the figures for aviation, aviation accounts for quite a large proportion of CO2 emissions within the European Union, although they have been declining recently. They also, I don't know whether it's included in others or not, but for some reason, agriculture is also not included here. And remember, in terms of general food production and processing, manufacturing, and so on, packaging, food production actually accounts for 1/3 of all of the EU's emissions. But still, in general, what we can see is that across the EU, there have been significant reductions pretty much consistently throughout the years. If we move on to the next one, if we look at this table, now this is something also we need to think about. Up until now, we've been talking about the European Union, assuming that the EU is acting as one. Now, remember, European Union politically at times does act as a one unified system, but remember, there are 27 individual nation states, all with their own separate climate policies, environmental policies, sustainable development policies. Okay, EU environmental policy, remember, is a shared competence. EU sets basic minimum, but the other states can increase or at least not reduce those. So what we can see in this table over here, again, we're talking about CO2 reductions. 23 of the member states showed a reduction. So overall, pretty good, but 5 states, member states of the EU, that is, showed an increase in CO2 emissions over those years. So again, what we can see here, certain states, so Bulgaria, reduction of 44%, but Cyprus, 58.7% change there. Latvia minus 57, Portugal plus 8. So what we can see here is in the different member states, we do have different policies, and that's very much something that needs to be focused on. Going back to returning to greenhouse gas emissions, again, very similar to the last one. So I think I'll just skip that one actually. So what is happening in Europe right now? So hopefully everyone has heard of the European Green Deal, presented in December 2019. So Ursula von der Leyen calling this a man on the moon moment. So very much a lot of emphasis being put behind this. There's going to be a lot of, could we say, been in Korea so long I can't speak English anymore. A lot of enthusiasm, push behind this. So it's a very ambitious strategy. Now the EU, as we've just seen in those other figures, has been pretty successful with its emissions reductions so far. It achieved its 2020 goals of reductions, but then also just recently has agreed that by 2030, it's going to try to reduce emissions by 55%. There were some in the EU who actually wanted more ambitious 60% targets by 2030, sorry, but they ended up just agreeing on 55%, which is still very ambitious. And then obviously by 2050, climate neutrality, which again is an improvement. Previously, they wanted by 2050 to be 80% reductions. So the EU very much focused on sustainable development and really driving home some of these climate policies, becoming a global leader, which is very similar, we'll talk about it in a minute, to Korea, if we sort of go back 10 years ago. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a minute. So obviously investment plans, they've established a new climate law. This one very important. So this was agreed in April of this year. And this climate law, like it says, enshrines climate neutrality into law. It basically means it is now binding, not on the EU as a whole, but on every single member state to also implement and achieve these targets. So that's quite an important one. Also, a new EU strategy on adaptation to climate change. Again, just for time, we'll carry on. Various different initiatives, biodiversity, renovation. So in terms of older buildings that are renovated, improving efficiency, farm to fork. So again, coming back to that idea of food production, food waste and so on. Circular economy. So for those who participated in the webinar on Tuesday by Solveig, a lot of this was also mentioned in that webinar. So we can move on. Implementation of the Green Deal diplomacy. So again, EU wanting to achieve global leader status through this strategy, basically going around the world, trying to promote climate diplomacy, energy diplomacy, basically Green Deal diplomacy. What are the challenges though? It's a very ambitious approach. Can they achieve this? Based on what they've done so far, there's no reason to say that they cannot, but it is an ambitious approach. Will Green Deal diplomacy work? Theoretically, yes. It's going to be harder to implement. There's going to need to be quite a lot of cooperation between the different parts of the EU. Also, like we said, establishing commitment from all of the member states is going to be quite difficult. If we look, for example, at phasing out coal and the use of coal, especially if we go over to countries like Poland, Czechia, so the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, even Germany, they're quite dependent, not fully dependent, but they use a lot of coal. For them to phase out coal by 2030, which is the target, that's going to require a lot of investment, a lot of resources for those countries to achieve that, which means the other member states are going to have to help out quite a lot. Avoiding internal competition. So again, we're talking about this Green Deal diplomacy. Who is going to take the lead on this? Will this be the Commission who takes the lead, or will it be the External Action Service under the High Representative? Obviously, there's overlaps there. There could be some changes. And also enforcing environmental law within the EU. The new climate law should make that easier, but within the EU, introducing environmental law and enforcing and implementing those laws has in the past been a little bit more tricky. Okay, so if we come on now to Korea, again, slightly updated. Carbon dioxide emissions in South Korea. So from 2007, so again, we have FTA coming in here, and we can see stabilized a little bit, started to decrease, but then from 2014, they've been increasing. And up until 2020, that has continued. If we skip over to this graph here, again, 2017 onwards, business as usual is projected up here. We can see with the current targets by the Korean government, pretty much they're going to only reach this level of reduction, which is still highly insufficient. We're going to go above an increase in temperature of 2 degrees. So in order to reach the Paris climate targets, actually South Korea is going to have to reduce its emissions by 2030 by around, I think, 66, 67%. There's going to have to be huge changes in South Korea to meet those. Now, here's where we could see much more cooperation between the EU and Korea. So as we were just talking about earlier, I think it was talking about batteries. So we talk about batteries becoming now the third most traded product from Korea into the EU. Electric vehicles and so on, could that be the future? So there is room for cooperation there. I'll just do this very quickly. The Korean New Deal, the much bigger project within the Korean New Deal is obviously the Green New Deal. So again, They very recently, within the past sort of year, massively increased their targets. Before that, there was a lot of criticism that Korea just simply was not doing enough. Okay, so whether that's based on the European Union also increasing its targets, becoming more ambitious, whether it's also to do with the US elections and Biden coming in and again being very much more pro environment, climate change. I cannot answer that, but definitely the Koreans have become much more ambitious in their approach. Their NDCs, so nationally determined contributions, have increased a lot. They're going to start looking at a shift away from nuclear power. Now, this is a very big issue in Korea. It's been a big issue over the past 10, sort of 15 years. Different governments have very much focused on nuclear power and very much promoted nuclear power. Under Moon Jae-in, bit of a shift away from that towards renewables. So that's maybe a little bit of controversy. Renewable energies plan to increase those by up to 40% by 2034. Phase out of coal energy. So there were 4 new coal power plants supposed to be constructed between 2015 and 2029. Those 4 have now been taken off the table. So there is very much a move in the direction away from coal. Again, under the new policy, potentially a move away from nuclear power. Carbon removal technologies to increase and so on. Infrastructure for electric vehicles, sorry. So in 2021, they want to increase those by 116,000. Government's providing a lot of subsidies for those, strengthening the circular economy, and so on and so forth. Obviously, in May, just a few weeks ago in Seoul, there was the summit partnering for green growth and the global goals 2030. So again, just reaffirming South Korea's commitment there to achieving those goals. This one I'm going to skip over fairly quickly just for time. But obviously in Korea, we've had during the FTA 3 different administrations, Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, and Moon Jae-in. They have all had different policies towards energy and environment and climate change. In my opinion, the lack of consistency between them has been damaging to Korea's potential to become a leader in terms of green energy and climate change. I'll skip that one as well. So summary, EU ROC FTA has predominantly been an a trade deal. Increased cooperation, so there has been cooperation, but there's no binding legislation. Maybe that's something they could work much more toward on. Has the FTA proven successful in sort of developing environmental sustainable development? In my opinion, impossible to say based on all of the other different variables involved. The EU definitely has shown improvements reducing emissions, and so if there's much more cooperation between EU and Korea, there's definitely the potential they could both achieve their targets by 2030 and of course 2050. So that's where I'm going to finish. So thank you for your attention, and I'll pass back now to Christoph.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think your English is needed to mute, or your loudspeaker. I think your English is still pretty good, actually. Yeah. Good. So now we are moving to Europe, and now it's my pleasure and privilege, let's say, to hand over to Frank Röwekamp, whom I met almost exactly 25 years ago when he was giving me a lecture when I was at a university in Japan as a student. And he was enlightening me, introducing me into the secrets of Japanese business. And we met then a couple of years later back, again by coincidence. And I think it's the first time that I actually listened to him as a professor. So it's a kind of premiere for the two of us. Please take it over.
Christoph, thank you very much. And dear distinguished guests and colleagues, it's a privilege to be here today. Actually, I'm talking out of this building you see behind me, which is the East Asia Institute in Ludwigshafen, Germany. So I'm going to share my screen. Just a second. Just a second. So here we go. I hope you can all see that. And well, we talked a lot about the FTA between EU and Korea. Actually, Professor Kim Bon-chul has raised some interesting issues about relations of international law and domestic law and bilateral law. And actually, I touch a little bit on this as well. And briefly, I will skip over some benefits of the EU-Korea FTA. But then let's have a brief look what else EU and Korea are doing with other partners, just to grasp again here the magnitude of the challenge. And then I would like to have a very brief look on what does it all mean for businesses and actual trade, to have not just one FTA, not just a multilateral framework, but to have so many agreements in this world. And by example, I would like at the end to little bit talk about a potential way ahead. So here I just want to skip over. This is actually, of course, the topic of today. EU and Korea have established the FTA, and there are benefits in a lot of areas, no question about it. National treatment and non-tariff barriers are addressed. We have the technical barriers to trade, for example, how you perform customs inspections and formulas you need, and so on. And also we have, just to mention it, the dispute settlement, many things, which improve the situation between the European Union and Korea. But we have to see there's, of course, a larger context here. Trade is not exclusive between European Union and Korea. And just to mention a few things here, look what the European Union is doing in Asia. And you see EU has concluded a trade agreement with Korea. Recently in 2019 with Singapore. There's a trade agreement with Vietnam. Well, there is not exactly a trade agreement, but an investment agreement now basically negotiated with China. It was announced at the end of last year. A big political issue also. Well, we are talking about economics today, but we shouldn't completely forget the politics here. Of course, there's always big politics behind it. With Australia, not exactly Asia, but Oceania, so to say, there is now a trade agreement under negotiation, and there are many more in all over the world. And now, if you look at the Korean side, we have a similar picture, obviously. As you pointed out, besides the European Union, there's an agreement with the USA, with Australia, China, also Vietnam. Very important. Korea is also a member of the regional comprehensive economic partnership, recently concluded in Asia. And also here, we have many more things. So it's not just one, it's many. And well, if you look at each of those, it probably looks good, but there are also certain problems going with it. And this is that, well, each trade agreement has a kind of similar structure, obviously. And if you look at the contents, at the table of contents, you will find similar headlines, or same headlines. But if you look at the details, very often we create different rules and standards in various details. It goes down to really pretty nitty-gritty business. I just mention here an important document each exporter knows very well, the so-called Certificate of Origin, where an exporter needs to prove, well, my goods have been really manufactured here in this country to a certain degree. And there are a lot of items actually to be built in and to certify. And these certificate of origin are different now sometimes for each trade agreement we deal with. And other documents, as customs declarations and many other things, standards to fulfill for the products. And what I would like to point out is that these differences, well, create a lot of bureaucracy, especially on the level of individual enterprises. And just to mention an example, I'm sitting in Ludwigshafen, and I think most of you know Ludwigshafen is a headquarter of a famous chemical company you all know, which is also a big investor in Korea, actually. I myself happen to be a member of another chemical company, by coincidence the same company as Christoph's formerly. And those companies have logistic and shipping departments, of course. And in these departments, there are hundreds of people employed and hundreds of people handling bureaucracy for the most part and handling different rules and did you get this and that. And it's complicated, and it takes, it creates a lot of cost, actually. And if I imagine that these hundreds of people working in the shipping department were in fact chemical developers working on environmental friendly productions and products, sometimes I ask myself, wouldn't that be better? And we have to keep these bureaucratic things, these different rules and what they mean, these rules, we have to keep this in mind. And I found it actually very impressive when before Professor Kim Bon-chul demonstrated here the amount of domestic laws which had to be changed because of an individual FTA. So this creation of bureaucracy then obviously is not only on the level of individual enterprises, but it's only on the level of legislation, regulation, and all these kind of things. And as positive as such an individual FTA is, we also need to keep in mind a little bit that we have a multilateral trading regime, basically with the WTO and the GATT rules, and the proliferation of bilateral free trade agreements somehow reflect a little bit a crisis, on the other hand, for the multilateral trading regime. And we should not completely forget that. We cannot turn it back. We cannot say, oh, don't do FTAs and things like this. But I believe we have to work on certain points. And the most important, in my opinion, would be, well, the most important word is really standardization. A certain kind of watch, that the rules you do in a way get kind of standardized. Ne? Yeah, EU, from the EU side, ne? Let's try, ne, when we talk about the Korea-EU FTA, and we should try the utmost, ne, to implement this also in the EU-Japan FTA. And not have different rules here and there and those, because that makes things complicated and is actually a hindrance to trade then. And here now one topic, and again, I have to refer to this interesting presentation of Professor Kim. And here I disagree a little bit, no? Because yes, it is necessary to talk about development and refreshment and things like this, no? But let's not bring in all the time new ambitious topics, yeah, which are complicated before we have solved other things. And I would promote, ne, let's talk about standardization, ne, before complicated extension. And if we talk, for example, about rules on social and labor standards, environmental rules, ne, well, we all know it's really complicated because there's a lot of, let me say, values of different people which flow in here. Ne? Yeah, is it okay to work 8 hours a day, or shouldn't it be 7 hours? How about weekend work? Ne? Where starts youth protection and women's rights and all these kind of things? Boy, it's complicated, ne? And you can really have a big fight on that. Ne? Environmental standards as well. Well, it's obviously it's very important, ne? But ne, let's focus on the real important issues, and let's work on also on standardization, so that our bureaucrats, yeah, in the companies and in the government and in the authorities, ne, are freed, ne, from making ever more complex individual rules. And just to give you an example here, ne, randomly, ne, you see, EU and Korea, ne, have concluded trade agreements with Vietnam, ne, both, and so how about now work on a unified EU-Korea-Vietnam agreement, and reduce complexity by this, ne, and see where are the differences and why, ne, and let's squeeze them out. Ne. On the other hand, ne, for example, in Asia, ne, we have the regional comprehensive economic partnership, but we have Korea is not part of it, but for example, we have the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific partnership. Ne. There are also overlaps, ne, for example, Australia and New Zealand and Japan and Vietnam, ne, are members of both. Ne. All are members of RCEP, ne? And there is room, yeah, to stratify. And stratification and standardization translates into ease of business. And I think this is also an issue, a homework, which should not be forgotten before we move on to extremely ambitious topics and talk about this for years, maybe without making much progress then. Well, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So, thank you, Frank. This was great. Yeah, I love this standardization because this is maybe what we learned together when we were working at the same time for this German company starting with a B. Everything was about standardization. So last but not least in the lineup is Ramon, whom I met a few years back when we were both talking at an event at the European Center for International Political Economy. And I live in Korea since 11 years. Ramon doesn't live in Korea, he lives in Europe, but he was outperforming me by far. And it's always a pleasure, let's say, to listen to him. I give you now the floor, Ramon.
Thank you for the invitation to ACCK and whether to attend this event and participate. I'm going to share my slides, which will be quite brief. I'm going to focus on a topic that is slightly different from what has been covered so far, because it is a topic on which the history of EU-Korea cooperation in the context of the FTA has been limited. But now there is this political push, and not only economic push, but political push to strengthen cooperation. And this is the topic of connectivity, which of course is part of the EU's strategy towards Asia, and of course is also part of Korea's strategy towards Southeast Asia, Central and Russia. So as I said, I have not many slides, only 3. I'm going to start by looking at the connectivity strategies of both sides, the Korean side and the European side, before I move to what has happened so far, which, as the title of the presentation implies, has been limited, but also what might happen in the not so distant future, because there are strategies on both sides to strengthen cooperation in this particular area. So if you look at the connectivity strategies of the 2 sides, you see clear overlaps. On the left-hand side, you have the Eurasia connectivity strategy from the European Union, and 4 areas that are highlighted by the EU: transport, energy, digital, and the human dimension. On the right-hand side, you have the South Korean new Southern policy from the current government, the Moon Jae-in government, and also the Russian Central Asia connectivity strategy, the 9-bridge action plan, the new Northern policy, also from the current government. It's interesting to know that the new Southern policy, of course, President Moon wasn't the first one to focus on this part of the world, but it is true that he has created a strategy, a blueprint, that when you talk to people in MOFA, in MOTIA, they say, well, this blueprint is going to survive the current administration in one way or another. Similarly, when it comes to Russian Central Asia, this wasn't the first government to focus on this part of the world, so this is a blueprint that will continue in years to come. And you see the overlap, particularly in the area of transport or infrastructure, because they are usually they're not exactly the same, but they usually refer to similar issues. So we're talking, for example, about the air travel, rail travel, but we're also talking about the infrastructure to make this happen. When it comes to digital, this is a priority for the European Union and also from the for the Korean side as well. And there's even talk about cooperation at a broader level. For example, there's this talk about the T10 that would involve the EU, Korea, Japan, the US, several democracies in trying to promote digital connectivity. And when it comes to energy, I find this very interesting, because when it comes to energy, both of them, the European Union and Korea, are net energy importers, right? And they see the potential for cooperation in this area as well. The human or people-to-people dimension obviously has been happening for many years, and whether, for example, has been working on this for several decades now, the people-to-people dimension of connectivity. So you see that the strategies, there is quite a bit of overlap, and there's also overlap in terms of the regions, because even though the EU talks about an Asia strategy, for the most part, connectivity is one of the areas in which connectivity would happen with partners is Southeast Asia and South Asia, which obviously is the focus of the new Southern policy from the South Korean government. So what has happened so far? We do have an existing framework in place supporting connectivity, coming out of the FTA, but also coming out of the strategic partnership agreement that the EU and Korea signed at the same time as the FTA. And you have a couple of agreements that you can see are very recent, right? We have the data adequacy agreement. Talks have been concluded very soon, at some point in this year. The data adequacy agreement should start to enter into force. The European Union would agree to the different European institutions, and we have a horizontal aviation agreement that dates back only to last year. So you start to see how the framework is being created. Also at the level of agreements, which, as was mentioned before by a couple of the speakers, is very important from the European perspective, because this leads to a legal framework, right? So some sort of legal underpinning of the agreement between the European Union and Korea. We also have a set of dialogues and working groups on cyber, the digital economy, environment, energy, and climate change, which can lead potentially to agreements. And when it comes to cyber, for example, there's increasing cooperation between the Korean side and the European side. Ambassador Reiter, for example, who is attending, is co-editing a book together with me and with another colleague at BUB on cyber relations between the EU and Korea, for example, and there are so many areas in which there is cooperation between both sides. And there are some projects like Eurexis, for example, that promotes people-to-people connectivity, and of course H2020, now Horizon Europe, that also promotes people-to-people connectivity. So there is a framework out there that is promoting cooperation between the EU and the ROK, coming out, as I said, not only of the FTA, but also of the strategic partnership agreement between both sides. So we do have a solid framework, but compared to some of the other areas that have been mentioned by some of my fellow panelists, let's say, for example, when they were talking about climate issues, clearly there is less cooperation than there is in other areas. But we do have the political will for cooperation to take place between the two sides and to strengthen cooperation between the two sides, not only at the bilateral level, but also as part of multilateral frameworks. Some people will say, well, this is a reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, the Korean side and the European side will say, well, it's not only about a reaction. We have been working on connectivity strategies for a long period of time. But regardless of the reasons, it is clear that there is more cooperation taking place between the EU and Korea. So, for example, if we start with agreements, the EU has signed sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure agreement with Japan, has also signed a similar agreement with India very recently, and Korea is the next country on the list with which the European Union is looking at signing a connectivity and infrastructure agreement, which would boost cooperation in these areas I mentioned before, especially in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Interestingly, the Korean side has proposed, why don't we start with a project and then we can sign the agreement afterwards. This comes because, for example, the agreement with Japan has not produced any project yet. So we have the framework, but we don't have the material component of connectivity. So it might be that with Korea, the starting point is a project first, the material component, and then we can build the agreement. In any case, this agreement is going to create a framework for cooperation in this area, in connectivity and infrastructure development. If you look at the docs and working groups, the EU and Korea recently announced that they're going to launch a transport dialogue before the end of the year. So in the second half of this year, there should be the first dialogue on transport, which, as I mentioned before, even though it focuses only on transport in theory, it relates to infrastructure more broadly, right? So again, this shows the interest on both sides in strengthening cooperation in this area. Plus, there are discussions about potentially launching a health dialogue. We don't know if this will happen or not, but clearly on the Korean side, there is an interest on strengthening health cooperation with the European Union. This could lead to further connectivity, for example, at the people level, right? This could support connectivity in this area. So we see a growing number of dialogues and working groups that are going to start to enter into force or potentially enter into force in the coming months. If you look at projects on the European side, the European Union is actually putting the money where its mouth is, right? So we have the policy dialogue support facility between the EU and the ROK. ACCK is part of this policy dialogue support facility. BUB is as well. And what you do see here is that this project is supporting over 3 years dialogues, strengthening of dialogues between the EU and the ROK, and this includes the dialogues that refer to connectivity as well. For example, as I mentioned before, digital is a priority for the European Union. This is an area in which we can potentially see a strengthening of cooperation leading to more digital connectivity in the two sides. There is also a SIWA, which is a project that the EU has launched with several partners across Asia to support a stronger cooperation in the area of security. But when it comes to security, this is broadly understood, and connectivity increasingly is part of security as well, right? Areas such as energy, for example, could be included in this security cooperation infrastructure as well. So you have this project also from the European that will lead to greater support to connectivity with Korea, and as I said, with other Asian partners such as, for example, Japan or Singapore. And there is also the North Asia IPP, which actually should support greater transport connectivity between the European Union and countries in North Asia, because the European Union also has agreements such as the one it has with Korea on air traffic with Japan and with China. So the idea that the European Union has is to create a hub, connectivity hub, so to speak, in air transport between the European Union and North Asia, especially once the pandemic is fully over and air travel resumes in a more normal way. But to this bilateral level, we need to act the multilateral level. Both the European Union, some EU member states, such as Germany, France, and Italy, for example, and Korea, are part of these different multilateral initiatives to support among others, support greater connectivity. We all know that Korea was recently a guest at the G7 summit. It signed the Open Societies Agreement that includes, among other things, a section on digital connectivity, on the digital society and digital connectivity. If this becomes a more permanent organization, such as D10, clearly Korea is going to be there as one of the Asian countries, right, along with Japan, along with Australia, probably along with India as well, that will be part of these initiatives. There is the T10 that I mentioned before, that should start with cooperation in the area of semiconductors, but increasingly would lead to more cooperation in the area of tech. So this would lead to greater tech connectivity between the EU member states, Korea, and some other countries, US, Japan, UK as well, for example. And then there is the infrastructure initiative announced by the G7 at the summit that took place only a few days ago, pushed by the Biden administration to support quality infrastructure, what is labeled as quality infrastructure at the global level. And in this area, of course, there would be cooperation with the G7 members. But if we are talking about the development of infrastructure in Asia, and especially again in Southeast Asia and South Asia, clearly there would be cooperation with Korea as well. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much, 감사합니다. And it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramon. It was good to be connected. I think it's a very good topic for closing, let's say, the session. I have two options, let's say, for my closing now. So actually, I was looking for really an active panel discussion, but I think Araza would say now, it's perfect timing. So it's 5:57 or something, and 5:59 here in Korea. I think all of the professors here in the room, but also in the rooms in Europe, did a tremendous job. Normally, I would ask the audience to applaud. I could do this here in the room, but I think it's not appropriate. Maybe it's appropriate, but I skip it. So my role is finished for managing the panel, and I would like to hand back to Professor Kim Shi-hong to close the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. A little bit expected some discussions even from the guest participant, but as of now, let them come. So we may conclude meeting today. Yes, the collaboration with European Chamber of Commerce in Korea has been quite successful within a certain degree. And I found that discussion throughout today's symposium, I have known that from the economic side, yes, we have good reason to modernize our FTA, but from the legal perspective, there are lots of a kind of obstacle to overcome. That is, therefore, I think really a big surprise. Bong Chol Kim today really became big star for today's discussion. I never expected for this, but very interesting. Also, Dr. Frank mentioned that, yes, that is true. Not only going forward, but also very much standardization of the existing agreement, how to harmonize, and localization and nationalization of the existing international agreement is something quite different from just going forward. It reminds me that kind of, when we study European integration, the issue of deepening and widening. Simply widening is not enough. Better to making more complete integration first and then enlargement. That is another lesson probably we have to earn a session today. Many thanks to all of you, the excellencies, and also Chairperson dear Lukat, also the speakers for today from Korea and also from Europe. Also Ramon shared our valuable time with us. Again, by the end of September, there will be another conference regarding EU East Asia connectivity. In that conference, not only coordinators our EU Center, but also the former ambassador here in Korea, Mikhail Aitro, will join us. Therefore, many will continue. Again, many thanks to all of you, and goodbye.
Thank you.
그냥 끄면 되나 이제?